Like so many sectors, the rise of AI and social media and personalization has changed what it means to have effective marketing. It's also changed what it means to be someone who is a marketer, a practitioner of the art of marketing. To unpack these heavy topics, I talked to one of the best in the industry, Jim MacLeod. It's going to be a hoot. So let's get started. Right, Jim, it is great to chat with you. So before we go too far into our conversation, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jim MacLeod. I have been professionally working in some sort of marketing capacity in one way or another for about 23 years now. I started as a graphic designer, but working for a book publisher, but then quickly started working within the marketing department there to start developing new products. And from there, I kind of kept focused on graphic design, but then I got into what was at the time called web design. Now we call it UI or UX, but got into that part, and then that led to web development, and then that led to digital marketing, and then that led to social media, and it just kind of keeps growing and growing. So now it's all kind of digital experience and design and brand all kind of mixed together.
So you mentioned you started off as a graphic designer, and so at some point you were like, "I really enjoy graphic design." So when did that happen? What got you thinking about graphic design as a potential career path?
It's actually kind of an interesting almost mistake. So I originally wanted to be a comic book illustrator. Like that was my original goal, was to be a comic book illustrator. And one of my favorite artists at the time was a guy named Todd McFarlane. And I knew he had studied graphic design in college. And I liked how he and a couple other artists really had some graphic elements in their illustrations. So I thought, okay, I'll study graphic design. And originally I just studied it as a fallback in case illustration didn't work out. And two things happened, which was this was the mid to late 90s. So the comic book industry fell apart. Marvel was in bankruptcy, if you can even imagine that now, considering what Marvel is. But at the time, they were failing. And I really fell in love with graphic design because it really appealed to the meticulous nature of how I like to do my work. It's so much easier to just hit undo on something than to have to like erase and redraw something. So it kind of worked out in both ways where I really got interested in graphic design at the same time that the industry I wanted to go into was falling apart.
When you said you mentioned like you were using basically digital tools essentially from the very beginning. What was your first tool that you used?
My first, the original design tools that I used, I think the first one I used was Photoshop, and it might have been Photoshop 3. It was, I know we were excited when they introduced layers. So this is 1995, 96 or so when I started using that. And then I learned Quark and I kind of cheated my way through Illustrator, which was, I didn't cheat, but I didn't really do all the work I was supposed to do. And which is funny because later on, the second company I worked for, I used Adobe Illustrator for everything, and ever since, it's still my favorite program to work in.
Did you ever doodle or like sketch before you got into Photoshop, or was it mostly just a Photoshop was an inspiration in terms of how easy it was to create content, and that's what really sparked it for you from there?
Well, one thing I used to say in my early interviews was I'm looking for a way to design, to kind of mix my ability to draw, like I can do some rough sketches, and the computer technology. And so, like that was my line when I was starting out because I had a really weak portfolio. But now, even still, I do a bunch of sketching. I mostly use the iPad now. And that was something that I was doing a lot of at my most recent company. And I've just started doing more illustration on my LinkedIn posts because I realized that, okay, like I'm posting on LinkedIn a lot more. And, I'd find some sort of image and stuff. And I'm like, wait, people have paid me for years to do sketches for them, whether it's a book cover, whether it's a diagram to raise money, whether it's a newsletter header. People tend to like my sketches. I'm like, why am I trying to find stock photography that everyone else is drawing from when I can actually just create my own illustrations in a style that people tend to like?
Yeah, I noticed in your, I think one of your latest newsletter posts, you actually talked about how you're switching the visuals from using stock photography to your own style
Mhm.
of it. How much does it add to time it takes for you to create your content though? Because it's like one thing to go to like Unsplash or a stock photography site, find something, add it, modify it, tweak it, versus come with your own sketches itself? Do you have a portfolio of sketches you just have in your background you're just going to pull from, or do you actually create it custom for each content you're creating?
I create them custom. So I've only done it in two. I've done it two times. I have a third diagram. So I'll get to that in a second. But I've got a third one also that I haven't put in. But so yesterday's one was based on the show Secession, because most recent episode tied into a just a story that I had lived through when I was working for a company that was going through layoffs. And so all I did was I found a photo and I kind of drew on top of the photo and added some effects to it. But that was 6 minutes, 7 minutes to create that illustration because it's something that I do for fun already. So just drawing on the iPad is fun for me.
Yeah, I think that's the part that I was curious to know. You generally just enjoy sketching, and so this was just a way
Mhm.
of combining something you already enjoy with another thing you enjoy, which is creating content, and just combining two things together, which makes a lot of sense then.
Yeah, I can't believe it's one of those things where I'm like, I can't believe it took me this long to realize. I'm like, wait, this is what people like. Why am I not providing that? And it's something that I like to do. I would much rather draw than sift through stock photography. Looking through stock photography is painful, especially if you have something specific in your mind. Now, one of the things that I've tried dabbling with a little bit, but I haven't gotten too deep into, is using some of these AI programs
Yeah.
for generating images. And so like I keep asking like, okay, I want two people standing back to back, shoulder to shoulder, blah, 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 like, something, like I've got the picture in my head and I'm trying to tell the, whatever system I'm using to generate that image. But one of the things I've started thinking about, and actually what led me to this realization was, what if I did a sketch first, uploaded the sketch and said, do it based on this general layout? But then that's when I was like, well, wait, why am I doing this? Why am I using, you know, Midjourney or something else when I can just take my original sketch and use that as my image because nobody else can create that.
Yeah, I was about to ask about AI tools because that's a big area these days where you can
Mhm.
either have it generate exactly the content you're looking for in an approximate way, or if you already have the skills to create a basic sketch, use that as the basis for what it might end up creating. And anything we should touch upon that maybe a little bit later because I think there's a lot to unpack in that whole world of just
Okay.
AI tools in general. So getting back to how you got started, so you were working in graphic design. What was the transition from graphic design to marketing? Like, because they are, at least today, there are two different career tracks at any company you go to.
They definitely are. And one of the things last year I co-wrote an article for ZDNet with my old boss, a guy named Bala Afshar, and it was about the road to CMO. And so what we did was we found, okay, here are 10 or 20 of the top, I think it was 20 of the top marketers that are out there, and where did they get their start? It wasn't, most of them weren't just traditional, like, okay, I went to school for marketing and I started as a marketing specialist and worked up to CMO. A lot of them had, really unique career paths, including, I think, the CMO for Salesforce. I think she started as a chemical engineer, which, so that's a pretty long journey. But to get back to your question, my journey was I realized that a lot of companies don't really value design and graphic design. It's something that's kind of a nice to have. It's often added on after the fact. So what I did is I started to extrapolate out my career and think, okay, where am I going to be when I'm 50, when I'm 60? What's my salary range going to be? And then the scary part was, okay, if I'm 55 years old making X number of dollars, why wouldn't a company hire somebody that's 25 years old that makes half as much but can provide 80% of what I provide? I'm like, companies are going to do that, every day of the week. So I realized, okay, my career on the trajectory that it was on is going to end before I'm ready for it to end. Because and we're seeing that now with AI, like a lot of careers are coming to an end pretty soon.
Yeah.
But so it's like, okay, I wanted to kind of almost future proof my career and start to move to the side and take another avenue. And I was fortunate because at the time I was working with all these great, amazing marketers. And I was like, okay, I need to learn as much as possible from them. I just started consuming everything, books and courses and everything. I went back, I got my master's in marketing, like it, and it's still to this day, like that's really where I find a lot of interest. So Somebody recently described me as a marketer who happens to be good at design, which is great because that I'd much rather be that than a designer who also kind of knows marketing. Because, like I said, there's a ceiling to a designer, which is usually creative director, and that's about it. How many companies have a chief creative officer or VP of design? It's very few.
Yeah, and even in companies where they do have that official role, at least from my observation, the influence they often have is not very much, it's often every company has their things that are the primary driving force. It could be
Mhm.
the engineering team, it could be the sales team and so on. And you had always like stack rank, where does each of these disciplines fall? And it's often difficult to find, especially what I've seen like design and marketing being a core part of the decision making structure on something that happens. So that's spot on.
Yeah, and it's tricky. So anybody in marketing knows that everybody else outside of marketing is the best marketer in the world, and their ideas are better. Because marketing is one of those things that everyone thinks that they can do, like they understand and they can do it. Well, multiply that by 10 when it comes to design, because everyone's got an opinion on design. And the problem is, if you're paid enough at a certain level, your opinion then becomes fact. No matter how much somebody might have expertise, their opinion matters more than somebody's expertise if they have a better title and get paid more at the end of the day. So that's where it can be frustrating as a designer. Like most designers you meet have at least a little bit of a chip on their shoulder because they've spent their whole career being told what to do by people that don't have their level of expertise.
Exactly. And the other, example I often run into is that you might have a very great idea or a talented team in-house, but then you hire a name brand agency from elsewhere. And then by
Mm-hmm.
default, what they say becomes like, oh, they said it must be good, even though it might have been exactly the same as what your own team might have come up with a short while ago. And the optics of it are always very tricky. I always look at these as like, how do we rationalize that? Because it doesn't scale, at the end of the day, because budgets for external companies is very high. You also spend a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
hiring talented people as well. How do you reconcile this rift? Whereas in some other disciplines like engineering, it's very clear cut on like, yes versus no. Whereas when it comes to emotion, it's a wide range. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what the right answer is. And so much of it is in the presentation itself, in how you prepare the messaging as opposed to messaging directly. And those are all it's like art.
Yeah, and this was something that I really tried to drive home with the last group of designers that I managed. I managed three different teams of designers at my last company, which is you need to be able to show the value to why you made the decisions that you made. Because it's really easy to be like, oh, well, I think this works better in a rounded button or a button with rounded corners that's blue looks better with this design. That doesn't matter. Like personal opinions don't matter when you're talking to people that have a higher level of authority than you. But if you can say, okay, studies show that if we use a magenta button here, our click-through rate is going to go up 12%, then that's what kind of helps. Because I found that once you start talking about the science behind design, then people will listen more often. And I've gotten into battles with people about this, where they're like, I don't like this. There's too much white space and blah, 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 blah. But then what I do is I explain the science behind why a particular paragraph can only be so wide on a page. And I ask questions. So I had this discussion one time where somebody they didn't like all the white space on the page. It was basically like less than a third of the page was white, and then the text took up the other two thirds. And they said, no, the text should go the full length. And the question I asked was, when was the last time you read a book that was 8.5 by 11? You don't. Books are smaller because, and I talked about the science behind like, okay, your eyes get tired if it has to carriage return further over. It's harder to find where it is. You're not supposed to have more than 12 words across in the line, like kind of all the science behind why that design was made the way it was. It's it's not just because I liked it. There's knowledge that I was given to make those decisions.
Yep. One of the things you often talk about is how important it is for people in marketing and in design to have an understanding of mathematics and science and being able to rationalize some of these things. And I think it's partly to help provide an extra layer of validation where, yes, this is the right design for, it looks good, it's aesthetically pleasing, and all these things. But oftentimes in a business, the goal is more tangible metrics. Will it lead to greater conversions? Will it cause more sales? Will people spend more time on my content because of these changes? And being able to
Mhm.
tie those in with those kind of metrics, often very critical. What do you do in situations where the data just isn't there or it's incomplete?
And that's when it can become a tug of war a little bit. But and you can refer back to other campaigns that might have worked well in the past and be able to draw certain lines to say, okay, we saw this thing in the past that worked or didn't work, and we can infer from that because you don't necessarily know, okay, this new campaign that we don't know how it's performing, it has these attributes. Like we usually you put certain attributes into a campaign that's based on stuff that's worked in the past to say that, like, okay, there should be, we should be seeing some success from this, even if there isn't a clear cut, okay, 30 people downloaded this white paper, 15 of them became customers. Because there's always, it's a lot more, marketing is a lot more complex than just that. It'd be easy if it was, though.
Do you conduct A/B testing sometimes, or is it just too complicated to use on at scale?
When possible, I try to do A/B testing. It's more often than not, it's something that I, in my career, haven't had time to do enough of. But one of the things I try to do, because I like digging into the analytics of things. Like there are times where I'll spend 6 hours in Excel data sheet and spreadsheets just pulling data in and seeing and cutting data to try to see, okay, what's performing, what patterns am I seeing across all these different campaigns or posts or whatever it is, so that we can see what's working and what's not working. Um, Sorry, I fell off track. Your question
It's our A/B
again?
testing, and how frequently.
A/B testing, yes. So what I try to do is, okay, like I look at the data like 3 days later after a campaign launches, for example, and say, okay, is this working? Yes or no? If we don't have time to do full A/B testing, because it's a lot of work to come up with two completely different campaigns, um, look at the data and see, okay, is this working? Is this not working? And then try to assume, like I said, based on previous campaigns, are there assumptions we can make to try to optimize this so that it might work a little bit better? And then, just keep measuring and adjusting, but you have to give it some time, in order to have a big enough source in order to be able to see what's working and what's not.
Do you think it's valuable for marketing teams and design teams to actually have data scientists and UX researchers on staff, especially these days when things, especially if you're doing digital marketing and you're going to a large audience, the variations may be very large.
Absolutely. When I was leaving EBSCO Information Services back in the fall, we were just starting to hire a data scientist because there was all this work being done. But the problem is, you've got these, marketing managers, product marketing people, campaign managers, whoever they might be, doing all this work, generating the content and generating the campaigns. It's better if an actual expert, somebody that really knows what they're talking about, can go in and analyze what's going on. Because if you have a product marketer that needs to go in and spend a day cutting through data, well, that's a day that they're not thinking of the next campaign or thinking of ways to shift the current campaign. So I'm a big fan of specializing your team once you get to a certain size, specializing your team so that you can have the right people working on the right things, and you don't have just a whole bunch of jack of all trades, master of nones working for you, where it's kind of like, well, I do a little of this and a little of this and a little of this and a little of this, and I'm barely above average on all of those things. Wouldn't it be great if you had a whole bunch of great people doing what they should be doing?
No, that makes a lot of sense. But the thing I often see in the trade journals and the business papers is that when the economy is doing great, everything is fine. When things start getting tough, the first places often companies try to trim down are often in marketing and often in
Mhm.
the typical outreach efforts, which are critical to reaching customers, but often are not seen core enough. How do you counter that trend?
Well, it depends. One of the things that's important to know when that happens is, what is your sales cycle like? Because most of those cuts are short-term thinking, right? Like they just need to make the next quarter's numbers. But the problem is, if you cut back on marketing now and you have an 18-month sales cycle, you're not going to feel that pain for a while. So it's okay, things slowly start to go down. Like it's not like, oh, we stopped marketing and things just stopped. Like it's always a slow burn going down if you're in B2B and you have a long sales cycle, or even like a medium length sales cycle. So what you try to do is show, okay, this is where metrics really come in handy. It's like, all right, what's our pipeline influence? What's our close one influence? If you have those numbers, that can help, stave off the cutting machine. And it also helps you determine what you should do more of and what you should do less of. I worked with somebody a few years ago that she knew marketing technology perfectly, and she knew which dials to turn when you wanted to up certain things or wanted to lower certain things. And it was it a skill like that is really important to have. So instead of like, okay, let's cut people or cutting headcounts or program dollars, okay, what if we reallocated from here to here and did this instead? And let's not do like this trade show next month because that's only going to get us, you know, 40 leads and 20 of them are going to be, junk. But what if we actually, change that over to, some sort of ad spend or some other type of outreach? I think that's where it's important when the people come to start cutting budgets. They're like, all right, let's reallocate to something we know is going to work if we really need the bump right now, and then we can try to revert to normal afterwards.
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. I want to take a few steps back, to something we talked about earlier on data-driven decision making and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The tension I often see is that, at least the conventional, word in the street oftentimes is that when you often do data-driven decision making for marketing or creative ideas, you don't get the next big thing. You just get iterative minor improvements over something. But if you have something really big that you want to do, the data will never be able to back that up, which often results in either designers being frustrated or the marketing agencies being frustrated and them leaving, starting their own thing where they get to try their trends out and experiment with it, and then it becoming some of the norm. My view always is like, what if we took a bet on them early before they had to leave and do all these things? What is your thought process on that?
Yeah, I think it needs to be a healthy balance of those things. You need to be able to take chances to try to get ahead of the crowd because as soon as one thing works, it's just a follower world. Everyone starts heading in that direction. Like we saw it a couple of years ago with podcasts, where everyone's like, we need to do a podcast. And everyone put out 4 episodes. And then a month would go by, they put out a fifth episode. And then 4 months would go by, they put out a sixth episode, and that's it. So they were taking chances because they're like, oh, this is the next big thing. But they didn't really have kind of the wood behind the arrow, if you will, because they're willing to take a chance. But, it wasn't the right move to take at the time.
Yeah.
So, but being data driven, sorry, I'll get back to a point in a second. Being data driven, I think, is important because that will help, make sure that you're still at least doing something that works. But you need to be able to take chances also because otherwise, yeah, it's just going to be exactly what you did last quarter with, like doing the same work and getting the same results every quarter. To me, that sounds really boring. Like, yeah, it might be safe, but you need to challenge people. Like people want to do exciting stuff and challenging things, but obviously we still need to keep the lights on and we need to do what works on top of it. So one of the things that I've often tried to do is like, okay, if you want to take on something new or if we want to try something different, that becomes like a +1 project. Where it's like, okay, in addition to all your regular work, you're also going to try this thing. And then, if it works, great, we'll figure out how to reallocate your workload. But if it doesn't work, it's not like we stopped doing something that is working.
I was about to ask exactly this because how do you balance someone's personal career ambitions within the confines of the organization they're ultimately in? And I think you just answered that really nicely in terms of that. The word you often hear today is like experimentation. It's like, yeah, we'll do an experiment. We'll see if it works appropriately or not. Is that something that at least I see in engineering quite frequently? Do you see that quite often in your industry as well, where the +1 stretch idea that you have given to someone, it does end up seeing the light of day in a very small targeted approach, see if it gains traction?
Yes. Yep. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you'll see somebody bite off more than they can chew, like the podcast example I just gave. Or, we've seen it many times where people will try to be like, oh, I want to do this thing, but I need to drop all these other things. Like, well, you still need to do your job, your regular job too, because we've got numbers we need to hit this quarter, right? So it's trying to find the balance of okay, how do you grow in your own career, um, and still do the work that's required of you. And I know, like when I was learning web development, it was like, okay, I'm going to spend my nights and weekends learning this stuff so that I can go to work or get my next job where I can do these things. Like I first picked up WordPress on 4th of July weekend 2007. And it was just basically like, okay, like I said, this weekend I'm going to teach myself I didn't teach myself all of WordPress, but I taught myself the basics of it. And it was like, okay, now that's a skill that I can bring to work. I was working for an agency at the time. And, this is now something else that we can offer in addition to the other things that we have because, I was willing to take that time because I didn't have the time to spend, I couldn't just spend 3 or 4 full days of a work week learning this one thing, because it was a small agency. But in larger businesses, hopefully they do have education budgets and more importantly than that, time to actually do that education because you need to let people grow or otherwise, it's that old saying that was going around a few years ago, which is, what if we train these people and they leave? And then the counter is, what if we don't train them and they stay? Because too often you see people are just kind of complacent in their jobs. They're not growing. They're not challenging themselves. They're just punching a clock, which is great. Some people do that and they're great at that. But you want those people that are willing to take chances and try new things and constantly be learning so that you can let them thrive and bring something new to the table that you didn't even think was possible.
That brings me to the next point. There's a lot of things that change in marketing, just like it has in technology, like WordPress.
Mhm.
WordPress is still extremely popular today. I think it's still like, I think majority, I think if you group together all the technologies out there, WordPress probably counts like 25 or 30% of the entire web's traffic. So it's still very much a
Mhm.
dominant player here. But what has changed? What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in marketing in your career so far?
You know what? I was having this conversation yesterday in one of the groups I'm a part of, which is okay, how has social media changed, for example? Because when I really started to focus on this stuff, social media wasn't really a thing. Like I remember sitting in client meetings pitching a blog and having to explain to them that it's not some 12-year-old girl's online diary. Like it's something that'll actually help and that, Google SEO loves WordPress and, telling this to companies because they're like, what? Blog? No, we're not going to do anything like that. Or being in a meeting and having social media categorized under new or alternative marketing, I think it was called at one point. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, no, you know what's alternative marketing? Like putting ads in the newspaper. That's alternative marketing because nobody does that anymore. Like this is where we're going. So social media obviously has changed, and but now we're seeing a whole new generation of it, which is kind of the bifurcation of all these social media networks, and we're getting more into the community aspect of things because community is really where you can get real value out of these things because people will listen to people more than they'll listen to any company. It's like word of mouth is the best marketing that there is. It's way better than any marketing you could ever create. And so a community is a great place for this. And I'm a part of a few communities that they are sponsored by companies, but there's nothing about the company in the community. And I think those are great because I'm meeting lots of other marketers and leaders in these different industries. But what's also happening in the background is it's creating brand affinity for when I do need a product that this company offers, they're going to be top of the list because, well, I already know, a bunch of people that work for the company and, a lot of other people in the group will vouch for them because a lot of them were customers beforehand.
Yeah, which often echoes the common saying that communities are about people and not about brands or
Mhm.
logos. And we see that in a developer space with developer relations. Oftentimes I look at them as an extension of effective marketing because these are people who resonate with the target customer in a very nice way. And they happen to also work for a company. So they have like this nice connection between I'm going to speak in a language that they understand. I'm going to talk about things that they're familiar with and care about, but it's also going to be done with the background of knowing that this is something that my company also provides. So if you ever need to use a solution, it works really well. And I think every industry has that. I was reading a document recently around this. Like, I love reading earnings reports from various companies. One of the
Yes.
things I always enjoy. I was actually reading about how aviation companies have now started going into the more the personalized route, where yes, you can always sell to the big organizations and the big buyers, like all the larger airlines around the world, but it's also about how do you sell to individuals who might be interested in it, or like communities of people, like universities might want to have like something to make travel between like their sports teams more efficient and so on, and how they have people who are both aviation like fans but also have a strong connection with either athletics or with some business or with some group
Mm,
that they are also actively a part in, and tying those worlds together has been a very effective way for them to increase their business. And I, back when I'm like, that is actually very interesting because it's not traditional marketing anymore. It's not as someone who just comes in, has a, buys you dinner and then you like have a conversation. These are people who are in the weeds with you, like at the games,
yeah.
at the stands, or at the sales conferences that you're also participating in. And they also happen to also sell airplanes on the side. And that connection has been really nicely tied together.
I worked for an IT networking company, like a Wi-Fi company, and originally the target audience was CIOs. But then what we found was, well, it's not the CIOs that are doing research on products like ours. It's the lower level people. So we need to speak to them and get them enthusiastic. And most importantly, help them sell it up the chain. And so it's basically, okay, how can we empower them? How do we make them the heroes in their company? And potentially something that works well in any industry or any type of marketing is how do we make them a hero outside of their company, raise their profile across the industry. And that helps get the vendor in, and it builds brand affinity even before they're a customer.
Yep. And you touched upon this in several of your content over the years, really around the differences between dealing with B2B companies and B2C companies. Because in the case you mentioned like this now, the person making the decision on what to do or not do is very different than the ultimate user of the product. Whereas in the B2C
Mhm.
space, you're marketing to the person who will actually be using as well. Can you talk a little bit more about just some of the big learnings you've gotten in the distance between both of those worlds?
Yeah, it's interesting being in B2B because in some ways you almost have to market to the end user to have them ask. Like you see this with any like drug advertisement that you see on TV. It's always like, here's all this thing, and then they talk about the million ways you can die, but it's always then, how, ask your doctor about whatever it is, because the average person can't buy this. They have to get it from the doctor. But in a way, it's kind of an end around your actual customer is by going to their customer, which is it's a difficult way to do it, because most, especially in B2B, most of your, or not most, but in some situations, your end users don't actually know what your product is because a lot of times it's white labeled. So, for example, when I was working for EBSCO, a lot of people like, it's amazing how many people have used EBSCO products and didn't know who EBSCO is or what they offer or anything like that because it's always white labeled and repackaged as the university's online library system. And same with working for a Wi-Fi company, same deal. Like nobody cares like who's providing the Wi-Fi; they just want good Wi-Fi. And so you almost have to think about like what's the is there a way to figure out what the customer satisfaction is? I'm sorry, not the customer, the user satisfaction is, and somehow find a way to present it to the customer prospect to say, hey, if you have this particular Wi-Fi, it can help you in these ways because people will want to stay at a hotel that has this type of Wi-Fi, and that might be something that you can promote. Same with online schools. Like it would be great if it was like, oh, well, people that subscribe to these databases have a higher graduation rate than people that don't, or than institutions that don't have that. Like that's an easy way to sell a product by saying your end users want this.
Yeah, and then there are often cases, especially with enterprise software, which I've often found, where it's often a case where end users don't want this. We often look at the cases of like, why are so many data entry products that people use, whether it's like a point of sale terminal at like any cashier area, or like what's something people use to enter data about their inventory, why are they all so horrible and they're so poorly done? It's
Yeah.
almost as if it's one of those cases where the marketing really is designed for the decision makers, the CIOs or CTOs around, for example, you have compliance. It works well in Europe because GDPR is now implemented.
Hmm.
You and I probably do not care that it's implemented. We're like, okay, great, I have a cookie banner now that he has to hit dismiss every now and then. And that's also the flip side I often see as well, where you get in the door in some of these B2B stories, because as you mentioned, extremely difficult to get into in the first place. And I apologize, my
Hmm.
cat decided to pay a visit right now, despite the door being closed. And you also have to figure out how do you balance it between appealing to, in this case, a doctor, in this case would be the CTO or CMO, and also
Hmm.
having the end user realize the benefits of it, which in many cases they have no say in what ultimately ends up happening. How do you justify some of that? Like, where you're marketing something that the end user is disconnected from the person who ultimately make the call on this.
It, yeah, that's a tricky one because if you manage to sell a product to somebody that's not using it, and then their end users or their customers don't like it, you're not going to get the renewal, right? So and that just leads to a bad taste in everybody's mouth. Um, so I think a good way to handle something like that is probably to make sure that the people you're selling to, are they sure they know what their end users are looking for? Have they surveyed their end users to see, okay, we want A, B, and C from a product like this, and then figure out, okay, do we offer that? And of course, any salesperson's going to say yes, whether they do or not. But it's how do you make sure that what you're selling is actually what you're selling? Because and that's where like customer success stories or case studies really come in helpful because it's like, okay, well, they saw this sort of uptick when they purchased this product.
So one of the other big changes I've seen over the years is around personalization. I think Google definitely did a big thing with like AdWords and making it so that it was contextual. So if you are interested in A, B, and C, you'll see ads related to A, B, and C. And it's often relevant to just the text-based ads. And then over the years, I started seeing like various sports stadiums having different types of screens where you're like, why is there a big giant green screen all the way across the stadium? It's not for the people in the audience. It's for when it's streamed online, they replace the green screen with contextual ads based on what data your TV or your media players collected about you over the years, and it shows it contextually. How much has that influenced how you think about marketing these days?
It influences it a bit, but the reality is whatever we're doing today is going to be totally different than what happens 6 months from now. And I know, Google and all these other ad networks have been using AI to really hone in on these things, but it's going to go through the roof pretty soon. I'm really fascinated to see where advertising goes and how personalized it can get with AI and how hyper targeted it can get. Like eventually, that it's going to be completely tailored towards me. Like if I'm watching a baseball game, for example, the ad that's on the TV is whatever ad that Fox or ESPN or MLB or whoever, that's the ad that everyone's seeing. But as time goes on, I think it will get more customized, more personalized in that way. And it's going to be amazing to do that. And I've heard some people joke like, we're eventually going to see content that is produced that is just made for individuals because they're going to be able to swap story pieces in and out so that it just becomes completely tailored to this person. They're like, this is the greatest show I've ever seen because it's got all my favorite actors, it's got all my favorite music, and it's got the type of humor that I like or the type of story that I like. And it's there, we're definitely a ways off on that sort of thing, but I can imagine it's coming at some point.
This goes into the AI world that we touched upon briefly earlier,
Mhm.
where with just a few prompts in English words, I can get visuals that are tailored to
Yeah,
whatever needs to be done for what I entered. Then we're also seeing a lot of text to video outputs now, where you can type in some text and you get videos out of it. You get audio as well. A lot of audio programs
yeah.
are doing all these various things. A few years ago, I don't know if you remember this, but Salesforce previewed something called Einstein Designer, where you can actually enter some ideas on like here's some layouts for a website. It'll generate many versions of it, and you can pick and choose like these are the 5 versions I want to A/B test essentially, and then deploy it and have people give feedback on what was done. And that was seen as like a completely new way of doing things because we talked about earlier, it simplified the technical complexity of both
Mhm.
generating the multiple variations because it requires dedicated teams traditionally to create each variation, give it the right level of polish and expectation of it being the final output, and then also have the technology to make it all work. And now it was like one click away from being able to have like very customized shopping pages and things that are very sensitive to minute changes in layout and colors and things like that. So you can experiment in real time on this. With AI, one of the things I can totally foresee is that every time I go to like Instagram Reels or TikTok and I see a video, for example, and half the time I'm like, this video is very on point. You see a little sponsor text at the bottom, like, this is very unique that, based on my interest, this video is very relevant and it's clearly sponsored because it's sponsored by label is there. It, at least as far as I can tell, it was done by a real human being, a real creative team and so on. Do you ever foresee a world where all of these things, just like how AdWords is able to give you text and links programmatically based on your interest, actual rich interactive content will also come out purely from this AI where you're like can't tell between reality and what is really just a virtual version of something trying to sell you things?
Yeah, it's absolutely coming. I took a there were a couple years where I wasn't really dealing with AdWords at all, and then when I picked it back up, it all of a sudden I was like, oh, well, I just have to upload pieces of the ad. I don't even have to, fully have finished ads anymore. You just upload the elements, and then Google puts it together and optimizes it so that it's going to work however best, so that it gets the most clicks and downloads or whatever else. And it was like, oh, okay, like this is, that was not the beginning, but that was early days of, yeah, you just upload a couple ingredients and then it makes the cake for you, and you sit back and watch the results.
Yep, and like, I think it's like the autofill feature in Photoshop was also one of those things where it's like auto.
Mhm.
I think the naming I always keep forgetting, but it's like the smart erase or the smart fill, where if you had like a power line in your photo, you just tell it that get rid of it, and it kind of interpolates between the surroundings in a more intelligent way and puts in the right
Yeah.
level of visuals there. And that was like mind blowing, like 5 6 years ago. And now we're just seeing it gone to a completely new level where you actually don't even have to be in that location. We'll make it so that you can have position yourself in that area and make it really nice.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible over the last 6 months what's been going on with AI. It really, and we all know AI was baked into a lot of products beforehand, but now it's basically like come to the people, and it's come down the mountain to the people, and yeah, it's incredible to just seeing what we've seen in the last 6 months is insane. I have no idea where we're going to be 6 months from now. If just think about the rate of change over the last 6 months, 6 months from now, we're not even going to recognize the world.
Exactly. The example I often like to use is like you're trying to fill up a dam with water. And so right now the water is flowing really quickly. Most of the time, by the time we realize the water is flowing very quickly, the water hits the end of the wall and it's just slowly just like rising very slowly. We're like 6 months in and we still haven't found the wall yet. The water's still going as fast as it can. And so no one really knows where the actual wall even is at this point. It's like the
Mhm.
wall there is a wall strong. Doesn't really matter because the end result of it is so compelling in all these areas because you create content, I create content. And for me, the thing about AI that often comes up is that in some ways it's almost an existential threat, at least for me specifically, because I create technical content, I create long form and I create videos, and that
Mhm.
finds its way into books. I've been using like all both Bard and ChatGPT for the past few months, and the quality of what it can create when I just tell it write me a detailed article on topic A, B, and C is
Yeah.
very good. Sometimes I put in the style of, and I put my name itself. There's enough content that they've indexed on me, so I read it. I'm like, this is exactly how I would have written it with the random jokes and stuff thrown in there. It's missing the visuals, missing the images. That's a moment in time thing because before it didn't do
Yeah.
code snippets, now it's doing code snippets. So I'm like, okay, it's only a matter of time before it realizes I'm going to combine stable, diffusion or mid journey and then create visuals as a part of it. And then I see externally all this data from like other marketing orgs where it talks about, this team over here trained ChatGPT to build 700 pages a day programmatically and publish it using the top SEO data that they've analyzed from all these areas. And so over a period of 6 months, they went from 0 page views to almost a billion page views purely from this programmatically generated content where no human being was involved. It's a pure pipeline of here are the top keywords that we want to target, create the content, publish it, and then just let us know what the metrics are. And there's often talk about like, will search engines end up like, banning auto-generated content or not? My thing is that how will you tell at some point? Once it gets really good, it's gonna be hard to tell between what is auto-generated and not generated. Where I feel like this world might make a lot of what I'm doing very much, irrelevant. Which goes into the topic that you've been talking about very recently, is around how do you manage your own personal brand, your own identity in a world where AI is commoditizing so much of what you might have thought were very unique capabilities that were not easily replicable.
Right. Yeah. And it's, the last month or two, I've realized, I'm like, man, I am glad that I made the switch from design to marketing because design's being commoditized. And, it's so easy to just create your own designs. And I know when I first heard about this, I kind of fought it. I'm like, I'm not going to use that. Like, I'm not going to empower this thing. But then I realized, I'm like, that's fighting gravity. Like, you will not win. So I started using it, and I had the realization, the shift in realization, which is this is in a lot of ways no different than when Photoshop came out. So when I first started studying graphic design, we were still setting type, letters by hand. Like we weren't allowed to use, like the computers were like tiny little things, like 9-inch screens or something in some other side room. So we were doing graphic design by hand to start, and which worked for me because I came from an illustration background. But I bet a lot of graphic designers up until the mid 90s fought against the computers, the machines taking over. But now you wouldn't even think of laying out a magazine or a newspaper or something like that and not using InDesign, right? So like it's just the way that it is. And I think with AI, it's the exact same thing. Like it's just another tool. But the good thing is skilled people will be able to use it better than non-skilled people. Like I'm going to be able to figure out what that prompt is to get that exact image faster than you might because I know exactly, I've got the picture in my head that I'm looking for on a screen, and somebody else might have like, well, I kind of want it to be like this and like that. And, it's, I can better describe, in theory, I can better describe what my prompt is than somebody that hasn't spent decades working in design and creating that image that looks up at a certain angle with the light hitting and, front light and backlight and all those sort of things. So in that way, I think, AI is just going to happen. We can't fight it.
Yeah, I guess the question oftentimes is like we talk about, it's called creative destruction. Is that you did something before, the world has gotten to the point where that skill is no longer needed because it became simpler or it became, unnecessary anymore. I guess like, traditional things like being very good at like fixing, mechanical things to do stuff in the house, which is now like all electrical and automatic and so on. I guess the question is, what is the next level of things that we can, higher order activities that we can now focus on, that all this time has been spent, doing this? Because often the great promise of industrialization from like the 1800s onwards was that because of machines, we'll now have more free time to do things that humans are very good at. But I think what we've really found is that what the free time that we've had has been filled up with more things to do to make you more productive. And the smartphones have only made that more challenging because now every moment of your day you have this extremely powerful computer at the time of your hands where anything you're doing is basically a zero sum game where if you're spending time on, say, Twitter, that means you're not spending time on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn and so on. And all these companies are trying to figure out, how do we squeeze every ounce of usage from you from all these devices? And I always worry that personalization and AI and some of these activities will make it that much more appealing, because imagine my phone knows far more about me than anything else that I do. So it has all the data about what I'm doing. Imagine you can translate all the data into something convincing, a convincing narrative that I am now excited about. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds exactly like what I would do, even though reality is it's actually based exactly on what I do. And it changes my behavior completely. Those are the things I often look forward to. I'm like, I'm actually looking forward to seeing what this world looks like. A part of it also a little bit terrifying as well. Like, how will it change
Mm-hmm.
how we often behave? Because we often read about people spending less time in libraries these days. Children don't go to parks anymore a whole lot because
Right.
they're always on their phones. So I'm like, yeah, that's a big change. And I think we can make a case that maybe it's good for you to be able to go to the park or go to the library. How much more things will be changed as a result of it, for the good or the bad?
Yeah, and so as somebody that used to like to draw a lot, I stopped for a long time, and then I found like I just filled my time with other things, and you can definitely feel your creativity levels go down, when you're not using it. It's like a muscle that you have to use. And I've heard some people talk about how creativity is the result of boredom in some cases. And the problem is we're never bored anymore because we have the entire history of the world in our pocket that we can access at any time. Like there's always something you can be consuming. And in the early social media days, I wrote it off as learning. I'm like, well, I'm learning all these things. Like that's how I kind of justified spending all my time on social media. But then I was like, okay, I need to slow down. And so what I would do from time to time is basically do like a detox. Like I would just, delete Facebook for a while or delete Twitter for a while and force myself to not do those things, so that I would be more creative because I think the big thing is for me, I would rather be a creator than a consumer. And as much as I like to learn, I like creating things, and so it's like, okay, I learn for a bit and then I take that learning and then create things from it. And the problem is, like you said, these devices and everything around us are trying to turn us into consumers. And what we don't want to end up is like the tubby people in Wall-E that are in those kind of like weird tub type things that it's just kind of like they just sit there and consume all day long, because then like in theory, like then we turn into the batteries in the Matrix, like it's a bad thing to just be a consumer. So I think we need people to create these things and create human experiences like you touched on earlier. I think that's going to be the key differentiator with everything being automated and changing into this, you know, almost disposable content because there's going to be so much low effort content being created thanks to AI that the humanity is what needs to shine through. And that is something that, AI is going to get there sooner or later, probably sooner. But for now, it's still the differentiator. Like I see the Iron Man in your background. Anybody can wear the Iron Man armor, but Tony Stark is the only Tony Stark. And
Exactly.
he can do things in the Iron Man armor that, Jim Rhodes can't do. Like there needs to be that human element driving the technology and not the other way around.
Yep. No, I think that's really well put. And so, as we start, wrapping this up a little bit, I want to have one question for you. What's a misconception about marketing that you wish people would reconsider?
That it's fun and games. I think a lot of people are like, oh, that looks like so much fun. And I've actually heard my mother talk about this, and she was always like on the product and engineering side of the house in her career. She's like, marketing's just the team that spends money. And I was like, but we're doing things. Like, yes, we're one of the few departments that's actually spending money externally, um, well, trade shows, events, mailers, whatever. But there is a science behind it. There's a reason behind what we do. And if it didn't work, companies wouldn't invest in it. Like we're not there just having fun blowing money. Like yes, people do have a lot of fun, when they're on marketing trips or whatever, but have you ever been to a sales conference? You think those folks are sober for 3 days in Las Vegas? I don't think so. Like everyone's having fun in what they're doing, but some people see it as kind of like almost like the important stuff and the not important stuff because it you need a great product and you need somebody to sell that product. Like a lot of like engineering driven companies think those two things. But without marketing, creating that triangle, nobody knows about that great product or who that salesperson is. I came up with a thing a while ago that said that, the serious decision stat from, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, which is 70% of the buyer's process is done before somebody raises their hand and reaches out to sales, or 70 or 80%, whatever that number is. Been a long time. It almost made me think of a baseball game. So marketing is basically your starting pitcher, and it's going to go 5, 6 innings and then hand it over to middle of relief, who's probably your SDR, and then your salesperson comes in as your closer. But a lot of people, but you can't win the game in just the eighth and ninth inning. Like you have to, have a good beginning of your game in order for the whole operation to work. You can't your salespeople going in cold is usually not a great thing.
Yeah. No, and that's it's so much. It's so true of so many disciplines as well. If you talk about like engineering, talking about design, or design talking about engineering,
Hmm.
marketing talking about engineering, and sales and support and all these various disciplines, is that every discipline has their own idea of like what is the most important, you know,
Right.
function that they provide in the org and how it's better than everyone else. And it's just fun to see
Hmm.
how all of that ultimately gets played out. Okay, I thought it was gonna be the last question. I actually have one more. I'm a
Okay.
huge fan of Mad Men. Like that's one of the shows that I always was like
Nice.
fascinated by. I'm guessing you've seen it as well, correct?
Yeah, there's a character on the show named after me.
Really?
In the sixth season, there's a character named Jim MacLeod who's in like one episode, and it's when you've watched it all the way through.
Yeah. Yes, all the way through.
Okay, so it's when Joan and Lou are out. No, they're not in California, but they're in some other office. They're not in the main office. But it's like, hey, what time is Jim MacLeod coming in today? And they're talking about this person. It's when Joan meets the guy that she dates through most of the last season. Like that guy that kind of walks in and pretends to be somebody else. He pretends to be a character named Jim MacLeod.
Wow. Wait. What is the TLDR on that? Like, how did that happen?
So years ago, I created a poster for Mad Men, just like a bootleg silkscreen poster. I designed it because I loved the show. I sold it on my website. I sold like 50 copies. It was silk screened, limited edition, signed and numbered. A director from the show reached out to me because he wanted to buy one. I'm like, sorry, it's sold out. He's like, can I commission you to make another one? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to update it, and then he was going to do another one. And then he went quiet for a while, and he came back. He's like, "You're a bootlegger, and I'm associated with the show. So because I sold Mad Men materials without Lionsgate approval, he couldn't work with me. Like it's one of those like because I sold illegal stuff. So I was like, okay, well, that's too bad. And then a year later, I'm watching the show, and Joan walks into a room and says, "Is Jim MacLeod here yet?" And I'm like, "Wait, what?" And so I'm guessing, because I also heard Matthew Weiner was somewhat involved with that discussion about the poster, um, that it was almost, I don't know why, but it might have been a coincidence that the only TV show that I've had direct access with somebody also had a character named after me, but I think it's unlikely.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely either. And so, how accurate is Mad Men in general in terms of how so much of marketing and design and sale, I mean, the marketing creative side of
Mhm.
the house, how does it work?
It, I haven't seen it to be all that accurate. Like I've worked with some great creative directors. I've never seen creative directors that can boss around everyone else in the agency. Like it's usually the account people telling the creatives what to do, not the other way around. As much as I would like that, there's a great line in there. It's like they can't do what we do and they hate us for it, or something like that, something along those lines. That like the account people hate the creatives because they can't be creative. Which also I don't buy. Can be creative. It's all unique. Um, but yeah, it's not. It's I wish it was like that, and definitely without the drinking and the sexism and all those things. Like I don't know where that exists, if at all, anywhere in the world. Thankfully, but yeah, I never worked for an agency like that, but I also didn't work for a big agency. So I'm not entirely sure what that's like. I've seen some online. I've seen some all-star creative directors, but the my favorite part about that show was seeing that spark of creativity, seeing when that light went off in his head, and then seeing his process of how he got to that creative inspiration. That was my favorite part of the entire show, because I love learning about process. I love creativity, and just seeing both of that in an all-time great show was a perfect thing for me.
Jim, thank you so much. That was a perfect conclusion to a very entertaining and informative story here. Keep creating the content you create. Always been a big fan of it, and hopefully more people will find it and also be as entertained and educated about all these topics like I have been for many years now.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.